Claire Thompson thought she knew her husband's schedule by heart, but the hushed phone calls at midnight told a different story. When she discovered David was secretly meeting his ex-wife Vanessa every Tuesday at the downtown Marriott, she made a choice that would change everything. Instead of confronting him, Claire decided to play the perfect, oblivious wife while quietly planning her escape. Little did David know that his deception would become the key to unlocking a version of Claire he never imagined existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Claire heard David whispering into his phone at 2 in the morning, she convinced herself it was work. After 15 years of marriage, she'd grown accustomed to his late-night conference calls with international clients. David was a successful financial consultant who prided himself on being available to his wealthiest investors around the clock. The hushed tones and careful footsteps to the guest bathroom seemed perfectly reasonable for someone trying not to wake his sleeping wife. But the pattern that emerged over the following weeks painted a different picture entirely. Every Tuesday evening, David would announce he was meeting potential clients for dinner. Every Wednesday morning, he'd return home energized in a way that reminded Claire of their early dating days. His cologne would linger differently, and he'd shower immediately upon arrival, claiming the restaurant had been too smoky or the handshakes too numerous. Claire had always been observant. During her college years studying art history, professors praised her ability to notice details others missed. Tiny brushstrokes that revealed an artist's emotional state, subtle color variations that indicated different time periods, inconsistencies that suggested forgery or restoration. These same skills now served a purpose she'd never anticipated. As she began cataloging the small changes in her husband's behavior with the methodical precision of a detective. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Claire was preparing dinner when David's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He was upstairs changing clothes, and the notification preview was visible on the locked screen. A text from Vanessa Rodriguez, his ex-wife from his brief first marriage 20 years ago. The message was partially visible. "Can't wait to see you next Tuesday. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the..." Claire's hands trembled as she stirred the pasta sauce, her mind racing through possibilities. David had always maintained that his relationship with Vanessa ended amicably, but completely. They had no children together, no shared assets, no reason for contact. In all their years of marriage, Vanessa's name had been mentioned perhaps 3 times, always in passing when discussing David's past. Claire had never felt threatened by this ghost from his history, had never even been curious enough to look her up online. Now, standing in their pristine kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, Claire felt the foundation of her carefully constructed life shifting beneath her feet. The dinner preparations continued automatically, while her thoughts spiraled through scenarios, each more devastating than the last. Was this an affair? Had it been going on for months, years? Were there others? When David returned downstairs, Claire managed to serve dinner with steady hands and engage in their usual conversation about his day at the office and her volunteer work at the local art museum. She nodded in appropriate places, asked follow-up questions, and complimented his choice of wine for the meal. All the while, she studied his face for signs of deception, noting the way his eyes brightened when he described a challenging new client, and how he avoided direct eye contact when discussing his evening plans for the following week. Sleep eluded Claire that night as she lay beside her husband, listening to his peaceful breathing and wondering how long he'd been living this double life. She thought about their recent anniversary dinner, how attentive he'd been, how he'd surprised her with tickets to the symphony she'd mentioned wanting to attend. Had Vanessa been in the picture then? Had his romantic gestures been motivated by guilt rather than love? The next morning brought a clarity that surprised Claire with its intensity. Rather than confronting David immediately, she decided to gather information. The art historian in her recognized the value of thorough research before drawing conclusions. She needed to understand the scope of this betrayal before determining her response. Claire's investigation began subtly. She paid closer attention to David's phone habits, noting when he received messages and how his demeanor changed afterward. She observed his grooming routine on Tuesday mornings, how he selected his clothes with more care than usual, how he hummed while shaving. She started documenting his explanations for his Tuesday absences, creating a mental catalog of the restaurants he claimed to visit and the clients he purported to meet. 3 weeks into her surveillance, Claire made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She would follow David on his next Tuesday evening outing. The thought of becoming the suspicious wife trailing her husband felt foreign to her nature, but the need for truth outweighed her discomfort with deception. On the appointed Tuesday, Claire told David she was meeting her book club for their monthly discussion. In reality, she drove to the parking garage across from his downtown office building and waited. At 6:30, she watched him emerge from the elevator, checking his appearance in the lobby's reflective surfaces, before stepping onto the sidewalk. Claire followed at a distance, her heart pounding as she navigated the early evening foot traffic. David's destination was indeed the downtown Marriott, but not the restaurant. Claire watched from the lobby seating area as he approached the elevators, pressing the button for the 14th floor. Her stomach churned as she realized he wasn't meeting a client for dinner. He was meeting someone in a hotel room. The confirmation of her worst fears should have devastated Claire, but instead, she felt an unexpected sense of relief. The weeks of uncertainty and self-doubt were over. She now possessed concrete evidence of David's betrayal, though she still didn't know the full extent of his relationship with Vanessa. More importantly, she had time to plan her response rather than reacting from a place of shock and emotion. Driving home that evening, Claire made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She would not confront David immediately. Instead, she would use the time to prepare for the conversation and its aftermath. If David could maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting an affair, then Claire could certainly maintain her own facade while planning her future. The following weeks brought an almost surreal quality to Claire's daily routine. She continued preparing David's favorite meals, asking about his day, and responding to his affection as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, she began making quiet inquiries about divorce attorneys, researching their shared financial accounts, and considering what her life might look like without him. The pretense became easier as Claire realized how superficial many of their interactions had become over the year. Their conversations rarely delved below the surface of daily logistics and social obligations. David seemed content with her responses to his stories about work, never pressing for deeper engagement or showing curiosity about her inner thought. This emotional distance, which had developed gradually over their marriage, now served as protection for Claire's secret knowledge. During this period of careful observation, Claire began to see her marriage with new eyes. She recognized patterns of behavior that had seemed normal but now appeared controlling. David's management of their finances, which she had appreciated as one less responsibility, had actually left her with little knowledge of their assets or spending. His encouragement for her to focus on volunteer work rather than returning to her career had seemed supportive but had actually made her financially dependent on him. The volunteer position at the art museum, which had felt like a meaningful way to stay connected to her passion for art history, now seemed like a hollow substitute for the career she'd abandoned when they married. Claire remembered her graduate school ambitions, her dreams of working in gallery curation or art authentication. She had convinced herself that supporting David's career, while contributing to the community, was equally fulfilling. But the lie of that narrative became clear as she contemplated starting over. As November arrived with its shorter days and cold rain, Claire found herself spending more time at the museum, extending her volunteer hours and immersing herself in the permanent collection. She rediscovered her love for the detective work involved in art authentication, the satisfaction of uncovering an artist's techniques, or verifying the provenance of a piece. These skills, dormant for years, felt newly relevant as she applied them to investigating her own life. The museum's director, Helen Carter, began to notice Claire's increased presence and renewed enthusiasm. Helen was a woman in her 70s, who had built the museum's reputation through decades of careful acquisitions and community building. She possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and direct communication style that Claire had always admired, but rarely encountered in her social circle of wives and charity volunteers. One afternoon, as Claire worked on cataloging a new acquisition of regional pottery, Helen approached her desk with a thoughtful expression. The older woman had been observing Claire's work with growing interest, noting her methodical approach and keen eye for detail. Helen's own journey in the art world had been marked by challenges and reinventions, and she recognized something familiar in Claire's current intensity. The conversation that followed would plant seeds for Claire's future, though neither woman realized it at the time. Helen mentioned the museum's need for someone with Claire's skills to work on a special authentication project, a collection of pottery pieces, whose attribution had been questioned by a potential donor. The work would require extensive research and analysis, possibly some travel to compare pieces in other collections. As Claire listened to Helen describe the project, she felt a stirring of excitement that had been absent from her life for years. The prospect of meaningful work, of using her education and instincts for purposes beyond organizing charity events and maintaining household schedules, awakened ambitions she had nearly forgotten. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, Claire glimpsed the possibility that this crisis might lead to opportunities rather than just loss. That evening, Claire sat across from David at dinner, watching him describe his day while her mind wandered to pottery glazes and firing technique. She responded appropriately to his commentary about market fluctuations and client demands, but her thoughts were elsewhere, imagining herself bent over ancient ceramic shards with magnifying equipment, piecing together the story of their creation. David seemed pleased with her attentiveness, unaware that her focus had shifted to possibilities he couldn't imagine. As he talked about his upcoming business trip the following week, Claire found herself wondering what other secrets his absences might conceal, but the thought no longer filled her with dread. Instead, it reinforced her growing certainty that their marriage had become a performance neither of them questioned, because the alternative seemed too complicated to consider. The transformation in Claire's perspective accelerated as she began to see her current life as temporary rather than permanent. The beautiful home they had decorated together now felt like a stage set for a play she no longer wanted to perform. The social obligations that had structured her weeks now seemed like distractions from more meaningful pursuits. Even her relationship with David began to feel like a habit maintained through momentum rather than genuine connection. As December approached, Claire realized she had been conducting her own investigation for nearly 3 months. The evidence of David's affair was undeniable, but more importantly, she had discovered something unexpected about herself. The woman who had felt devastated and helpless in October had evolved into someone capable of strategic thinking and long-term planning. The betrayal that should have destroyed her confidence had actually revealed strength she didn't know she possessed. The time for action was approaching, but Claire no longer felt rushed toward confrontation. She had work to do, decisions to make, and a future to design. David's deception had given her the gift of time and clarity, though he would never realize his contribution to her transformation. As she prepared for the holidays that would mark the end of her old life and the beginning of something entirely new, Claire felt ready to stop pretending and start building the authentic existence she had been denying herself for years. The holiday season arrived with its usual demands for perfection, and Claire found herself orchestrating their annual Christmas party with the same meticulous attention to detail she had always applied to entertaining. The guest list included David's colleagues, their neighbors, and the carefully curated social circle they had maintained for over a decade. As she arranged catered appetizers on her grandmother's silver platters and adjusted the lighting in their living room, Claire marveled at how naturally the performance continued even as her internal world shifted dramatically. David moved through the evening with his characteristic charm, introducing Claire to new clients and praising her hosting abilities to anyone who would listen. She watched him work the room, noting how effortlessly he maintained conversations about market trends, while his hand rested possessively on her lower back. The gesture that once made her feel cherished now felt like a claim of ownership, a public display of a relationship that existed more in appearance than reality. Mrs. Patterson from next door cornered Claire near the kitchen, gushing about how lucky she was to have such a devoted husband. "David was just telling me about the surprise anniversary trip he's planning for you," she said, her eyes bright with vicarious excitement. "How romantic that he's keeping all the details secret until the last minute." Claire smiled and murmured appropriate responses while her mind processed this new information. David hadn't mentioned any anniversary trip to her, and their actual anniversary wouldn't arrive for another 6 months. Either Miss Patterson had misunderstood something, or David was constructing elaborate covers for future absences. The thought that he might be planning extended time away with Vanessa while framing it as a romantic gesture for his wife struck Claire as particularly cruel, even by the standards she was learning to apply to her husband's behavior. Later that evening, as they cleaned up the remnants of the party, David seemed energized by the social success. He complimented Claire's dress, thanked her for making his colleagues feel welcome, and suggested they should entertain more frequently. His enthusiasm felt genuine, and for a moment, Claire wondered if she had misinterpreted the situation entirely. Perhaps the connection with Vanessa was innocent, a friendship that had rekindled without romantic implication. But when David's phone buzzed with a late-night message, and she watched his expression change as he read it, Claire's doubts evaporated. The same secretive satisfaction she had observed on previous Tuesday evenings crossed his features before he quickly composed himself and announced he was heading upstairs to bed. The new year brought an intensification of Claire's double life as she committed more deeply to the authentication project at the museum, while maintaining her facade at home. Helen had formally offered her a part-time consulting position, complete with a modest salary and access to the museum's research resources. The work involved examining a collection of Native American pottery that had been donated with questionable documentation about its origins and age. Claire threw herself into the research with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone around her, including herself. She spent hours studying firing techniques, analyzing clay compositions, and comparing stylistic elements across different tribal traditions. The methodical nature of the work appealed to the same analytical instincts she had been applying to David's behavior, but with far more satisfying results. The pottery pieces told stories of their creators through subtle variations in technique and decoration. A slightly uneven rim suggested hand building rather than wheel throwing. The specific minerals visible in the clay body indicated geographic origins. Burn patterns on the exterior revealed details about firing methods and fuel source. Each piece was a puzzle that yielded its secrets through careful observation and patient research. Helen proved to be an exceptional mentor, sharing decades of experience in art authentication, while encouraging Claire to trust her own instinct. The older woman had navigated her career in a male-dominated field, building the museum's reputation through a combination of scholarly rigor and strategic relationship building.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She recognized Claire's potential immediately and began introducing her to contacts in the broader art world. One particularly meaningful conversation occurred during a snowstorm in January that had closed the museum to visitors. Claire and Helen found themselves alone in the conservation lab, surrounded by pottery fragments and research materials. Helen had been observing Claire's growing confidence in her analytical abilities and her increasing absorption in the work. "You know," Helen said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined a particularly interesting shard, "I started working here when I was about your age. My husband thought it was a nice hobby that would keep me busy while he built his legal practice. He never imagined it would become my life's work." Claire looked up from the microscope where she had been studying surface textures. "Did he eventually understand how important it was to you?" Helen's laugh carried a note of irony. "He understood when I started earning more than he did, and when museums across the country began seeking my expertise. By then, though, we'd grown so far apart that understanding came too late to save the marriage." The revelation that Helen had experienced her own marital dissolution while building her career provided Claire with a different perspective on her current situation. She had been viewing her potential divorce as a failure, a destruction of the life she had worked to create. Helen's story suggested it might instead be a liberation, an opportunity to discover what she could accomplish when her energy wasn't divided between maintaining a relationship and pursuing her own interests. As winter deepened, Claire's authentication work began attracting attention beyond the museum. She authored a preliminary report on the pottery collection that impressed the donor enough to recommend her to other collectors seeking similar services. Word spread through the small but connected community of art authenticators, and soon Claire was fielding inquiries about additional projects. The financial implications of this developing career became increasingly relevant, as Claire continued her private investigation into David's activity. She had always assumed that any divorce would leave her financially vulnerable, dependent on alimony, and whatever settlement she could negotiate. The possibility of earning her own income through work she found genuinely fulfilling changed the entire equation. Meanwhile, David's Tuesday absences continued with clockwork regularity. Claire had long since confirmed that his claimed business dinners were fictional, but she resisted the urge to gather more specific details about his relationship with Vanessa. The emotional impact of his betrayal had somehow lessened as her focus shifted toward building her own future. She no longer felt compelled to understand every aspect of his deception because it no longer defined her sense of self-worth. This emotional detachment allowed Claire to observe David with something approaching anthropological curiosity. She noticed how he had compartmentalized his life, maintaining his role as attentive husband and successful professional, while pursuing whatever relationship he had rekindled with his former wife. His ability to switch between these personas seemed to require little effort, suggesting either exceptional emotional compartmentalization or a fundamental lack of genuine engagement with any of his relationships. The realization that David might be equally superficial in his connection with Vanessa as he had become with her provided Claire with an unexpected source of comfort. If his affair was motivated by the same desire for novelty and validation that had characterized his approach to other aspects of his life, then it likely wasn't a profound love story that diminished her worth as a partner. Instead, it was simply another example of his inability to maintain deep, authentic connections. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an invitation that would test Claire's carefully maintained equilibrium. Helen had been asked to present their pottery authentication findings at a regional conference of museum professionals, and she wanted Claire to co-present the technical aspects of their research. The conference would take place over a long weekend in Boston, requiring Claire to travel and potentially miss one of David's Tuesday evening activities. The prospect of presenting their work to a professional audience filled Claire with a mixture of excitement and terror. She had not spoken publicly about art or research since graduate school, and the intervening years had diminished her confidence in academic settings. But Helen's faith in her abilities and the significance of their findings convinced Claire that this opportunity was too important to decline. When she informed David about the conference, his reaction was more supportive than she had expected. He praised her dedication to the museum work and encouraged her to make the most of the networking opportunities the conference would provide. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, though Claire couldn't help but notice how readily he accepted her absence during what would normally be one of his Tuesday meetings with Vanessa. The conference weekend proved to be a revelation for Claire in ways she hadn't anticipated. The presentation went smoothly, with their findings receiving positive feedback from colleagues who specialized in similar authentication work. But more significant was Claire's discovery of a community of professionals who shared her passion for art historical research and who treated her expertise with respect and interest. During the social events that accompanied the conference, Claire found herself in conversations about career opportunities, research collaborations, and professional development possibilities. Several attendees mentioned consulting work that might interest her, while others discussed full-time positions at institutions seeking someone with her background and emerging reputation. One particularly intriguing conversation occurred with Marcus Webb, the director of a small but prestigious museum in coastal Maine that specialized in American craft tradition. Marcus had been following Helen's work for years and was impressed by the sophistication of their pottery authentication project. His museum was seeking someone to lead their research department, a position that would involve both scholarly work and public programming. "We're looking for someone who can grow with the institution," Marcus explained over dinner on the conference's final evening. "Someone who brings both academic rigor and fresh perspectives to traditional craft study. Your background in art history combined with your recent authentication work suggests exactly the kind of interdisciplinary approach we value." Claire listened to his description of the position with growing interest. The museum was located in Millfield, a small coastal town about 2 hours north of Portland. The community had a thriving artist population, with numerous studios and galleries supporting both traditional and contemporary craftspeople. The position would involve curating exhibitions, conducting original research, and developing educational programs that connected historical craft traditions with contemporary practice. The salary Marcus mentioned was modest compared to David's income, but it would be enough to support herself independently. More importantly, the work would allow her to combine her academic interests with practical applications in ways that her volunteer position couldn't match. The opportunity to build a program from its foundations appealed to Claire's desire for creative control and professional recognition. When she returned home from the conference, Claire felt as though she had been away for much longer than 3 days. The house that had felt like a comfortable sanctuary now seemed constraining. Its perfect decorative choices, reflecting a version of herself that no longer felt authentic. David welcomed her back with apparent enthusiasm, asking detailed questions about the conference and expressing pride in her presentation's success, but Claire noticed that his interest in her professional activities seemed more abstract than personal. He praised her accomplishments in the same tone he might use to commend a colleague's promotion or a neighbor's home renovation project. His support felt performative rather than genuine, another aspect of the careful facade that characterized their relationship. The contrast between David's polite encouragement and the engaged professional conversations she had experienced at the conference highlighted how intellectually isolated she had become in her marriage. David had never shown curiosity about the specific aspects of her authentication work, the challenges it presented, or the satisfaction she derived from solving complex puzzles about artistic creation and historical context. Over the following weeks, Claire found herself thinking frequently about Marcus's job offer and the life it might represent. She researched Millfield online, studying its demographics, cultural institutions, and housing market. The town appeared to offer exactly the kind of community she had been missing, a place where artistic pursuits were valued and supported, where professionals collaborated across disciplines, and where her expertise would be both recognized and utilized. The practical aspects of relocating seemed manageable compared to the emotional complexities of ending her marriage. She could afford a modest apartment or small house on the salary Marcus had mentioned. The town's size would make it easy to establish herself quickly in both professional and social contexts. Most importantly, the work would provide her with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had been absent from her life for years. As April progressed toward May, Claire realized that her decision-making process had shifted fundamentally. Instead of wondering whether she should leave David, she was now planning how and when to implement her departure. The authentication work had given her both practical skills and professional confidence, while the conference had shown her a community where those abilities would be valued. The transformation from betrayed wife to independent professional had occurred so gradually that Claire barely recognized its completion until she found herself scheduling a follow-up conversation with Marcus about the position in May. The woman who had discovered her husband's affair 6 months earlier and felt powerless to respond had evolved into someone capable of designing her own future according to her own priorities. David remained oblivious to the fundamental changes occurring in his wife's perspective and plan. He continued his Tuesday evening absences, maintained his affectionate but superficial interactions at home, and expressed appropriate interest in Claire's museum activities, without recognizing their growing significance in her life. His inability to perceive her transformation would soon become the final evidence Claire needed that their marriage had been over long before his affair began. The morning Claire decided to accept Marcus's offer in Maine, she stood in her kitchen preparing David's coffee with the same precision she had maintained for 15 years. The familiar ritual of measuring grounds, setting the timer and arranging his breakfast, felt surreal as she contemplated how few more times she would perform these automatic gestures. Her hands moved through the motions while her mind calculated logistics, how much notice to give the museum, when to schedule movers, how to explain her sudden career change to friends who had known her only as David's wife. The decision had crystallized during a sleepless night, spent weighing possibilities against each other. Claire had always been methodical in her choices, preferring careful analysis to impulsive action. But as dawn broke through their bedroom windows, illuminating David's peaceful face as he slept beside her, she realized that overthinking had become another form of procrastination. The evidence was clear, the opportunity was real, and the courage was finally present. David descended the stairs in his usual morning routine, checking his phone while knotting his tie with practiced efficiency. Claire studied his profile as he scrolled through messages, noting the slight smile that appeared when he encountered something that pleased him. She wondered if Vanessa had sent an early morning text, but the thought no longer generated the sharp pain it once had. Instead, she felt a detached curiosity about how long it would take him to notice the fundamental changes occurring in his household. The Pattersons' barbecue is this Saturday, David mentioned between sips of coffee, his attention still partially focused on his screen. I told them we'd bring that spinach salad you make, the one with the strawberry. Claire nodded automatically, then caught herself in the familiar pattern of accommodation. Actually, I might not be able to make it. I'm expecting a call about a new project that could require weekend work. David glanced up with mild surprise. What kind of project? I thought the pottery authentication was finished. The question represented more curiosity about her professional activities than he had shown in months, and Claire recognized the irony that his increased attention coincided with her decision to leave. It's a position with a museum in Maine. Research director for their craft studies program. Helen recommended me after the conference presentation. Maine? David's expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching concern. That would require relocation, wouldn't it? Seems like a big change from volunteer work. The dismissive characterization of her museum position as volunteer work, despite the consulting fees she had been earning for months, reminded Claire why David's opinion had become irrelevant to her decision-making process. He had never bothered to understand the professional significance of her authentication work, or the reputation she was building in art historical circles. The opportunity is significant enough to warrant consideration. Claire replied evenly, refilling his coffee cup with steady hand. I'll know more after the conversation this week. David's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he answered without excusing himself from their conversation. Claire listened to him discussing market fluctuations with a client while she cleared his breakfast dishes, struck by how naturally he prioritized external demands over their relationship. The behavior that had once seemed like professional dedication now appeared to be a pattern of avoiding genuine intimacy with anyone in his personal life. After David left for the office, Claire called Marcus to accept the position in May. His enthusiasm was immediate and infectious, with plans for her to visit Millfield the following week to see the museum facilities and begin house hunting. The conversation lasted over an hour as they discussed her research interests, the museum's collection, and the collaborative projects he envisioned for the craft studies program. We have a vibrant community of working artists here, Marcus explained, his excitement evident in his voice. Potters, weavers, glassblowers, furniture makers, many of them are interested in the historical traditions that inform their contemporary work. Your expertise in authentication and art historical context would create wonderful opportunities for programming that bridges past and present. Claire found herself energized by his vision for integrating scholarly research with contemporary practice. The work would allow her to engage with living artists while studying historical techniques, creating a dynamic environment that contrasted sharply with the static perfectionism of her current life. The prospect of contributing to a community rather than simply maintaining appearances felt revolutionary. That afternoon, Claire began the practical preparations for her transition with the same systematic approach she had applied to her marriage investigation. She researched real estate listings in Millfield, noting the affordable housing options and the proximity to both the museum and the artist studios Marcus had mentioned. She contacted a lawyer to discuss divorce proceedings, scheduling a consultation for the following week while David would be at the office. The lawyer, Patricia Morgan, came highly recommended by Helen, who had navigated her own divorce decades earlier with the same attorney. Patricia specialized in cases involving professional women seeking independence from controlling marriages, and her reputation for achieving favorable settlements preceded her. During their phone conversation, she outlined the information Claire should gather about their joint finances and advised her to maintain her normal routines until filing papers. Document everything, Patricia instructed: bank statements, investment accounts, property deeds, insurance policies. Also, if there's evidence of adultery, that can affect settlement negotiations. though it's not required for no-fault divorce proceedings. The key is understanding your financial position before your husband realizes you're seeking legal counsel. The suggestion to document David's affair struck Claire as ironic, given how thoroughly she had already researched his Tuesday evening activities. She had photographs of him entering the hotel, saved screenshots of Vanessa's text messages when his phone was unattended, and detailed records of his lies about his whereabouts. The evidence that had once felt like confirmation of her worst fears now seemed like practical ammunition for negotiations. Claire's visit to Millfield the following week exceeded her expectations in every meaningful way. The town occupied a spectacular stretch of Maine coastline, with a working harbor that supported both fishing boats and pleasure craft. The main street featured galleries, studios, and shops selling handmade goods, alongside practical businesses serving the local population. The atmosphere combined the authenticity of a working community with the cultural sophistication of a place that attracted and supported artists. The museum itself was housed in a beautifully restored 19th-century textile mill, with galleries on the main floor and research facilities in the converted upper levels. Marcus gave Claire a comprehensive tour, introducing her to the current staff and explaining the institution's mission to preserve and interpret American craft tradition. The collection included everything from colonial-era furniture to contemporary fiber art, with particular strength in regional pottery and woodworking. The research library is our hidden treasure, Marcus explained as they climbed to the third floor. We have extensive archives of craft guild records, apprenticeship documents, and technical manuals dating back to the early settlement period. Previous directors have focused mainly on exhibitions, but there's tremendous potential for scholarly work that could contribute to the broader understanding of American material culture. Claire examined the carefully preserved documents with growing excitement.
The archive represented exactly the kind of primary source material that could support groundbreaking research in craft history. She could envision projects that would trace the evolution of techniques across generations, document the influence of immigration patterns on regional styles, and explore the economic factors that shaped craft production in different historical periods. The afternoon was spent touring the surrounding community, with Marcus introducing Claire to several local artists, whose work reflected the traditional techniques she would be studying. At the pottery studio of Sarah Chen, a ceramicist who specialized in wood-fired pieces, Claire observed glazing methods that echoed techniques she had identified in museum collections. The direct connection between historical and contemporary practice created exactly the kind of scholarly engagement she had been missing. "We're always eager to learn more about the historical context for our work," Sarah explained as she demonstrated glazing techniques on a large vessel. "Understanding how earlier potters achieved certain effects helps inform our own experimental approaches. Having a resident expert in historical methods would be incredibly valuable for the entire arts community." By evening, Claire had found 3 potential rental properties and scheduled second viewings for the following morning. Each option offered advantages: a cottage near the harbor with studio space for her own pottery experiment, an apartment above a bookstore in the town center with easy access to galleries and restaurants, and a small house with a garden where she could grow the herbs and vegetables she had only read about in cooking magazines. The house with the garden captured her imagination most completely. It was a modest Cape-style home built in the 1920s with wide plank floors, built-in bookcases, and a kitchen that looked out over raised beds and fruit trees. The current owners were artists who had maintained the property with obvious love, but were relocating to accept teaching positions in California. The rent was reasonable, and they were willing to leave behind the garden infrastructure and some furniture pieces they couldn't transport cross-country. Standing in the kitchen that evening, watching the sunset reflect off the harbor while mentally arranging her books on the built-in shelves, Claire felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from her life for years. This was where she belonged, not in the sterile perfection of her Portland home, but in a place where function mattered more than appearance, and where her work would contribute to a living community. The drive back to Portland the next day provided Claire with several hours to process the magnitude of the change she was implementing. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal 8 months earlier could never have imagined herself confidently negotiating a lease on a house in a town where she knew virtually no one. The transformation from dependent wife to independent professional felt complete, though she recognized that the most challenging conversations still lay ahead. David was already home when Claire arrived, unusual for a Wednesday evening. He was sitting at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine and a stack of client files. But his attention seemed focused on his phone rather than work. When Claire entered, he looked up with what appeared to be genuine relief. "How was your trip? I was starting to worry when you didn't call." The concern seemed authentic, and Claire felt a flicker of the affection that had characterized their early relationship. For a moment she wondered if she was making an enormous mistake, destroying a marriage that could potentially be repaired through honest communication and mutual effort. But then David's phone buzzed with a text message, and she watched his expression change as he read it. The familiar secretive satisfaction appeared briefly before he composed his features and returned his attention to her. The moment of doubt passed, replaced by certainty that she was making the right choice for both of them. "The trip was productive," Claire replied, pouring herself a glass of wine from the bottle David had opened. "The position is even more interesting than I expected, and the community seems very welcoming. I'll need to give an answer by the end of the week." David nodded absently, his fingers moving across his phone screen as he typed a response to whatever message had captured his attention. "That's nice, honey. I'm sure you'll make the right decision." His dismissive response crystallized everything Claire had come to understand about their relationship. David supported her professional activities in the abstract, but he showed no curiosity about the specific opportunities or challenges they presented. He encouraged her independence as long as it didn't interfere with his own pursuits or require substantial changes to their domestic arrangement. The realization that David would probably support her relocation to Maine, viewing it as an interesting hobby that would keep her occupied while he pursued his relationship with Vanessa, provided Claire with the final confirmation she needed. He wasn't invested enough in their marriage to fight for it, which meant her departure would likely generate relief rather than devastation. Over the following days, Claire continued her preparations with increasing confidence. She accepted the position with Marcus and signed the lease on the house with the garden. She scheduled movers for the first week of June, and arranged for her personal belongings to be packed separately from the furniture and household items that belonged to their shared life. The process of sorting through 15 years of accumulated possessions proved more emotional than Claire had anticipated. Items that had seemed meaningful when acquired now felt like artifacts of a life she had outgrown. The expensive dinnerware they had received as wedding gifts, the designer furniture David had selected, the artwork they had purchased to coordinate with their home's color scheme all belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. Instead, Claire found herself drawn to objects with personal rather than monetary value: the ceramic pieces she had made in college, books from her graduate studies, photographs from travels taken before marriage had narrowed her world to David's preference. These items would form the foundation of her new home, supplemented by practical necessities and pieces that reflected her emerging identity as an independent woman. The most challenging decision involved her grandmother's silver service, a family heirloom that had been displayed but rarely used during her marriage. David had always treated it as a valuable asset rather than a meaningful connection to Claire's family history. Taking it would establish her claim to objects with sentimental significance, while leaving it would symbolize her abandonment of the decorative role she had played in their social life. In the end, Claire carefully wrapped each piece and added it to her personal collection. The silver represented continuity with her pre-marriage identity and would serve practical purposes in her new life, where entertaining would reflect genuine hospitality rather than social obligation. As June approached, Claire found herself observing David with anthropological detachment, noting how little he seemed to register the changes occurring around him. She had gradually reduced her participation in their social obligations, declined to schedule dinner parties, and stopped managing his wardrobe and household preferences with her previous attentiveness. Yet he appeared not to notice these shifts, perhaps because his emotional energy was increasingly focused elsewhere. The Tuesday evening pattern continued unchanged, with David maintaining his fictional business dinners while Claire pursued her own evening activity. She had enrolled in a pottery class at a local studio, partly to develop skills that would complement her new research position and partly to establish routines that didn't revolve around accommodating David's schedule. The pottery class proved unexpectedly therapeutic, offering Claire the satisfaction of creating functional objects with her own hands. The tactile nature of working with clay, the precision required for throwing techniques, and the unpredictability of firing results appealed to her artistic sensibilities, while providing a meditative contrast to intellectual work. Her pieces were rudimentary compared to those of more experienced students, but the instructor encouraged her progress and suggested techniques for improvement. "You have good instincts for form," commented Janet Walsh, the studio owner, as she examined one of Claire's bowls during a recent class. "With more practice, you could develop real skill in functional pottery. Are you planning to continue with classes?" Claire's explanation of her upcoming relocation to Maine and new position at the Craft Museum generated immediate enthusiasm from Janet and several other students. The pottery community, they explained, was small and interconnected, with frequent exchanges of information about techniques, exhibitions, and career opportunities. Several class members had connections in Maine and offered to provide introductions to artists and institutions in the region. The support and encouragement Claire received from relative strangers contrasted sharply with David's polite but distant interest in her new pursuit. The pottery studio community welcomed her participation and celebrated her professional opportunities in ways that made her realize how socially isolated she had become within her marriage. David's friends were really his colleagues. Their social circle consisted mainly of other couples, where wives supported their husbands' careers, and most conversations revolved around status and acquisition rather than passion and purpose. As her departure date approached, Claire began practicing the conversation she would eventually have with David about her decision to leave. She imagined various scenarios, from shocked disbelief, to angry accusations, to relief that she was solving a problem he hadn't known how to address. Her prediction leaned toward the latter, given his apparent satisfaction with their current arrangement where both pursued separate interests, while maintaining the appearance of a successful marriage. The irony that David's affair had provided her with the motivation and opportunity to discover her own path to fulfillment was not lost on Claire. His betrayal had forced her to examine their relationship honestly for the first time in years, revealing how much of herself she had surrendered in the name of harmony and social acceptability. Without his Tuesday evening absences, she might never have sought meaningful work or developed the confidence to pursue an independent career. Her final week in Portland was marked by a series of small celebrations and farewell. Helen hosted a gathering at the museum to honor Claire's contributions to the authentication project and to wish her well in her new position. Several colleagues from the regional conference called to congratulate her on the Maine opportunity and to discuss potential collaboration. The pottery class organized a goodbye dinner where Claire was presented with a handmade vase created collectively by her classmates. These expressions of appreciation and connection stood in marked contrast to David's continued obliviousness to the magnitude of change approaching their household. He had acknowledged her career transition as a positive development but seemed to view it as temporary, perhaps assuming she would maintain their Portland home while commuting to Maine, or that the position would prove unsatisfying enough to bring her back within a reasonable period. The evening before the movers were scheduled to arrive, Claire sat in her soon-to-be former living room, surrounded by boxes and stripped walls where artwork had hung for years. David was upstairs packing for a business trip that would conveniently remove him from the house during her departure. Whether the timing was coincidental or calculated, Claire couldn't determine, but his absence would simplify the logistics of her transition. Tomorrow would bring the end of one life and the beginning of another. Claire felt ready for both the challenge and the opportunity that awaited her in Maine. The woman who had pretended ignorance while her husband conducted an affair had discovered something far more valuable than evidence of his betrayal. She had rediscovered herself. The moving truck disappeared down their tree-lined street at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, taking with it the carefully selected pieces of Claire's former life. She stood in the driveway of what had been their home for 8 years, keys to her new life clutched in one hand and divorce papers in the other, watching David's sedan pull into the garage. His business trip had been cut short by what he'd described as client complications, though Claire suspected Vanessa's schedule had changed and he'd adjusted his plans accordingly. David emerged from his car with the distracted expression he wore when managing multiple priorities, his phone pressed to his ear as he gestured to someone who couldn't see him. Claire observed him with detached fascination, noting how he moved through his environment without really seeing it. The absence of the moving truck, the empty spaces where furniture had stood that morning, the boxes stacked near the front door all failed to register as he concluded his call and approached her with his usual perfunctory smile. "You're home early," he said, leaning forward to kiss her cheek in the automatic gesture that had replaced genuine affection years ago. How did the museum project go today? The question revealed exactly how little attention David had paid to her explanations about the moving schedule, her departure timeline, and the permanence of her relocation. In his mind, she was still playing at career development while he managed the serious business of their financial future. The disconnect was so complete that Claire almost felt sorry for him. "David," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Inside, something in her tone must have penetrated his distraction because he looked at her more carefully, his gaze traveling from her face to the boxes, then to the empty spaces visible through their front window. Recognition began to dawn slowly, like sunrise breaking through fog, as he processed the evidence of systematic departure. "What's going on?" he asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand. "Where's all our furniture?" Claire handed him the divorce papers without ceremony. "I'm moving to Maine permanently. The position I mentioned is real, and I've accepted it. These documents formalize the end of our marriage." David stared at the legal paperwork as if it were written in a foreign language. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger as the implications settled into his consciousness. "This is insane, Claire. You can't just decide to end our marriage and move across the country without discussing it." "Actually, I can," Claire replied with calm. She had practiced but never expected to feel. "I've been discussing it with lawyers, with employers, and with myself for months. The only person I haven't discussed it with is you, and we both know why that conversation would have been pointless." "Months?" David's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from a neighbor walking her dog. "You've been planning this for months without saying anything?" Claire gestured toward the house, indicating they should continue the conversation inside. David followed her through the front door into their stripped living room, where the absence of familiar objects made the space feel like a stage set between performances. The echo of their footsteps on hardwood floors emphasized the emptiness that had been concealed by careful decoration. "I've been planning this since I discovered your Tuesday evening activities," Claire said, settling into one of the two chairs she had left behind for this conversation. "Since I learned about your relationship with Vanessa Rodriguez." The color drained from David's face as he realized the extent of Claire's knowledge. He sank into the remaining chair, his usual composure cracking as he grappled with the reality that his carefully compartmentalized life was collapsing. "How long have you known?" "Since October. I've watched you leave for your fictional business dinners, followed you to the hotel, documented your lies about your whereabouts. I know about the phone calls, the text messages, the way you shower immediately when you come home from seeing her." David's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront me?" "Because confronting you would have led to explanations, justifications, and promises to change. None of that would have addressed the fundamental problem, which is that our marriage has been over for years. Your affair was just the symptom, not the disease." The accuracy of her assessment seemed to hit David like a physical blow. He leaned forward in his chair, his head in his hands, as he struggled to process the complete reversal of his assumptions about their relationship. "So you're leaving me for another man? Someone you met at the museum?" Claire almost laughed at his inability to imagine any motivation for her departure other than romantic replacement. "I'm leaving you for myself, David, for the chance to do meaningful work, to live authentically, to build relationships based on genuine connection, rather than social convenience." "But we have a good life here," David protested, gesturing vaguely at their empty surroundings. "Financial security, social standing, a beautiful home. What more do you want? Purpose, passion, partnership. Things that can't be purchased or performed." Claire stood up, walking to the window that overlooked their perfectly manicured backyard. "When did you last ask me about my dreams, David? When did you last show genuine curiosity about my thoughts or feelings? When did we last have a conversation that mattered?" David's silence stretched long enough to answer her questions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of desperation she had never heard before. "We can fix this, Claire. I'll end things with Vanessa. We can go to counseling, take a vacation, start over. You'll end things with Vanessa until the novelty of reconciliation wears off and you need external validation again.
We'll go to counseling until the therapist starts asking uncomfortable questions about our communication patterns. We'll take a vacation where we'll run out of safe topics for conversation by the second day. Claire turned back to face him, her expression gentle but resolute. We're both intelligent people, David. Let's not pretend this is about one affair or one set of problems that can be solved with good intentions. The truth of her words settled between them like dust after demolition. David seemed to age before her eyes as he accepted the futility of arguments he hadn't yet made. What happens now? You review the divorce agreement and respond through your attorney. The terms are fair and straightforward. I'm not seeking alimony or punitive damages. I want my personal belongings, half of our liquid assets, and my freedom. That's it. 15 years of marriage reduced to a property settlement. Claire felt a moment of sadness for the idealistic couple they had once been, but it passed quickly. 15 years of marriage that produced no children, no shared passions, no common goals beyond maintaining appearances. We've been business partners managing a household for years. Now we're dissolving the partnership. David's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and Claire watched him glance at it automatically before catching himself. Even in the midst of learning about his wife's departure, he couldn't resist checking for communication from Vanessa. The gesture provided perfect punctuation to their conversation. I should go, Claire said, picking up her purse and the single suitcase that contained everything she needed for her new life. My attorney will contact yours to finalize the paperwork. The house sale can proceed once the divorce is complete. Where will you be staying tonight? David asked, seeming lost in his own home. I have reservations at a hotel near the highway. I'm driving to Maine tomorrow morning. Claire paused at the front door, looking back at the man she had shared a bed with for 15 years. For what it's worth, David, I hope you find whatever you're looking for with Vanessa. You deserve to be happy, just not at the expense of someone else's authenticity. The drive to Maine the following morning felt like a pilgrimage rather than a relocation. Claire had chosen the scenic coastal route, allowing extra time to process the magnitude of change she was implementing. Each mile north carried her further from the person she had been, and closer to the woman she was becoming. The landscape shifted from suburban development to rural farmland to rocky coastline, mirroring her internal transformation from constrained wife to independent professional. She stopped for lunch in a small fishing village, sitting at a weathered picnic table overlooking the harbor while she ate fish and chips from a paper basket. The simplicity of the meal, the authenticity of the setting, and the absence of social obligations to manage filled her with a contentment she had forgotten was possible. No one here knew her history or expected her to perform any particular role. She was simply a woman beginning a new chapter of her life. The final hour of driving took her through Millfield's neighboring communities, each with its own character and charm. Artist studios advertised pottery classes and weaving workshops. Farm stands offered fresh produce and locally made goods. Galleries displayed work by regional craftspeople alongside historical pieces that documented centuries of creative tradition. This was the world she was joining, one where skill and creativity mattered more than status and acquisition. Her new house looked even more welcoming than she remembered, with afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen windows and highlighting the herbs growing in the garden beds. The previous owners had left a bottle of local wine on the counter with a note welcoming her to the community and offering contact information for reliable local services. Their generosity reminded Claire that she was entering a culture of mutual support rather than competitive display. The first week in Millfield passed in a blur of practical activities, establishing utility accounts, registering with local services, and beginning the process of settling into her new home. But more significantly, it marked the beginning of her integration into the artistic community that would define her social and professional life. Marcus introduced her to key figures in the local art scene at a welcome reception held at the museum. The gathering was informal but purposeful, designed to help Claire understand the interconnected network of artists, galleries and cultural institutions that supported creative work in the region. She met fiber artists, whose techniques dated back generations, furniture makers who combined traditional joinery with contemporary design,
and potters whose glazing methods reflected both historical traditions and modern innovation. The conversation flowed easily among people who shared genuine passion for their work. Claire found herself discussing authentication techniques with a woodworker who specialized in colonial reproduction pieces, comparing notes on historical research methods with a weaver who documented traditional dyeing processes, and learning about contemporary pottery techniques from artists who respected her academic expertise while offering practical knowledge she could never gain from books. The boundary between historical and contemporary work is much more fluid here than in academic settings, explained Lisa Park, a textile artist who divided her time between creating original pieces and teaching traditional weaving techniques. We're all interested in understanding how earlier craftspeople achieved certain effects, but we're also exploring how those methods can inform current creative practice. This integration of scholarly research with living artistic tradition represented exactly the kind of intellectual environment Claire had been seeking without fully realizing. Her expertise in art historical analysis would contribute to the community's understanding of traditional techniques, while exposure to contemporary practice would enrich her academic work in ways that library research alone could never achieve. The museum's collection proved even more extensive than Marcus had initially indicated. Claire spent her first weeks methodically examining pieces, documenting their condition, and researching their provenance. Many items had been donated by local families whose ancestors had created them, providing unusually complete documentation of artistic traditions within specific communities. The opportunity to trace technical developments across generations of craftspeople offered research possibilities that could reshape understanding of American material culture. One particularly intriguing discovery involved a series of ceramic pieces created by 3 generations of the same family, documenting the evolution of glazing techniques from the mid-19th century through the early 20th century. The earliest pieces showed influence from European traditions brought by immigrant craftspeople, while later examples reflected adaptation to local materials and environmental conditions. The most recent pieces demonstrated technical innovations that solved practical problems while maintaining aesthetic continuity with family traditions. This is exactly the kind of documentation that makes our collection unique, Marcus explained as they examined the ceramic series together. Most museums have individual pieces of exceptional quality, but they lack the context that shows how techniques developed over time within specific communities. Your authentication skills help us understand not just what we have, but how it fits into larger patterns of cultural development. Claire's work quickly attracted attention beyond Millfield. Her preliminary research on the ceramic collection led to inquiries from other museums interested in similar analytical approaches to their own holding. Within a month of her arrival, she had been invited to consult on authentication projects at institutions across New England, establishing a reputation that extended far beyond her new home community. The financial implications of this developing consulting practice exceeded Claire's expectations. While her salary from the museum provided sufficient income for her modest lifestyle, the additional revenue from authentication work allowed her to consider investments in her own creative development. She enrolled in advanced pottery classes with Sarah Chen, purchased equipment for a home studio, and began developing the technical skills that would complement her academic knowledge. The learning curve proved steep, but exhilarating. Working with clay required patience, precision, and acceptance of failure that challenged Claire's perfectionist tendencies, while teaching her to value process over product. Her early attempts at throwing pots resulted in collapsed walls, uneven rims, and glazing disasters that would have frustrated her intensely in her previous life. Here, surrounded by artists who viewed mistakes as learning opportunities, she found herself laughing at her failures and eagerly attempting new techniques. "You're developing good hand sensitivity," Sarah observed during a particularly challenging session where Claire was attempting to center clay on the wheel. "The academic understanding you bring to historical techniques gives you advantages that most beginning students don't have, but you still need to develop the muscle memory that comes only through practice." The combination of intellectual knowledge and physical skill development created a satisfying completeness that had been missing from Claire's work life for years. Her research informed her practical understanding of ceramic techniques, while hands-on experience enriched her academic analysis of historical pieces. The integration felt natural and productive, suggesting she had found not just a career but a calling. Evening social life in Millfield revolved around gatherings that combined pleasure with professional development. Artists frequently invited each other to their studios to see new work, share techniques, and collaborate on projects that crossed traditional boundaries between disciplines. Claire found herself welcomed into this community with warmth that reflected genuine interest in her contributions, rather than polite accommodation of a newcomer. One particularly memorable evening occurred at the home of Robert Hayes, a furniture maker who specialized in pieces that incorporated multiple craft traditions. His dining table had been created through collaboration with a weaver who had designed the inlay pattern, a metal worker who had crafted the hardware, and a woodworker who had provided expertise in joining technique. The piece represented exactly the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that characterized the Millfield arts community. We've learned that the most interesting work happens at the intersections between different craft traditions, Robert explained as the group examined the table's construction detail. Historical craftspeople often worked in multiple media out of economic necessity, but contemporary specialization has created artificial boundaries that limit creative possibility. The conversation that followed explored ways that Claire's research could document historical examples of cross-disciplinary collaboration, providing contemporary artists with models for their own innovative projects. Her academic expertise, rather than setting her apart from practicing artists, positioned her as a valuable collaborator who could contribute historical context to contemporary creative work. By autumn, Claire had established herself as an integral part of both the museum's operations and the broader arts community. Her authentication work had generated enough recognition to attract major consulting projects, while her research was contributing to exhibitions and publications that elevated the museum's national profile. More personally, she had developed friendships based on shared interests and values, rather than social convenience or spousal connections. The contrast with her former life became starkest during moments of unexpected happiness. Watching a sunset from her kitchen window while her hands were stained with clay from an evening's pottery work, Claire realized she hadn't thought about David or their divorce proceedings in days. The absence of constant low-level anxiety about maintaining appearances or managing someone else's moods had allowed space for contentment she had forgotten was possible. Her transformation was most visible in the mirror, where a stranger with calloused hands, sun-touched skin, and genuinely relaxed facial expressions looked back at her. The expensive skincare routine and professional styling that had maintained her appearance as David's wife had been replaced by the natural glow that came from meaningful work and authentic relationships. She looked older but somehow more vital, weathered by honest labor rather than preserved by careful maintenance. The approaching anniversary of her departure from Portland passed almost unnoticed, marked only by a brief email from her divorce attorney, confirming that all paperwork had been finalized and property settlements completed. David had not contested the terms, had not attempted contact beyond legal requirements, and had apparently moved forward with his life as smoothly as she had with hers. The mutual relief was almost comical in its completeness. Claire's new life had solidified into routines that reflected her authentic preferences, rather than accommodations to someone else's expectations. Morning coffee was consumed while reviewing research notes or planning pottery projects, rather than managing household logistics for two people. Evenings were spent in her studio or visiting with friends, rather than maintaining social obligations that served professional networking purposes. Weekends involved hiking coastal trails, attending gallery openings, or working on collaborative projects with other artists, rather than hosting dinner parties designed to impress David's colleagues. The financial independence she had achieved through her museum salary and consulting work provided security that felt more substantial than the wealth she had shared with David. Money earned through her own expertise and effort carried different meaning than funds managed by someone else for shared, but not necessarily common goals. Her modest house with its functional furniture and handmade decorations reflected her values more accurately than the designer showcase she had maintained as a married woman. As winter approached, bringing shorter days and longer evenings, perfect for studio work, Claire prepared for her first holiday season as a single woman. Rather than generating anxiety about social obligations or family expectations, the prospect filled her with anticipation for celebrations that would reflect her chosen community and authentic relationship. She was planning to host a small gathering for friends from the arts community, featuring food she enjoyed preparing and conversation that mattered to everyone present. The invitation list included people who knew her as Claire the authentication expert, Claire the pottery student, Claire the museum researcher, and Claire the friend. None of them had known her as David's wife, the woman who had accommodated herself into near invisibility while maintaining the appearance of a successful marriage. That version of herself felt like a character from a book she had read long ago rather than a role she had performed for 15 years. Standing in her studio as snow began to fall outside, surrounded by pottery pieces in various stages of completion and research materials for her current authentication project, Claire felt the deep satisfaction that came from alignment between her values and her daily life. The betrayal that had initially seemed like devastating destruction had instead cleared space for reconstruction, according to her own specifications. David's affair had inadvertently given her the greatest gift possible, the motivation to reclaim her authentic self. 2 years after leaving Portland, Claire stood in the main gallery of the Millfield Museum of American Crafts, surveying the exhibition that had consumed her professional energy for the past 6 months. Hidden Histories Women Artisans of Coastal New England represented the culmination of research that had taken her from dusty archives to contemporary studios, documenting artistic traditions that had been overlooked by conventional art historical scholarship. The opening reception buzzed with conversations between museum visitors, local artists and scholars who had traveled from across the country to see her work. The exhibition had grown from Claire's authentication research into something far more ambitious, a comprehensive examination of how women craftspeople had influenced regional artistic traditions, while remaining largely invisible in official record. Her discovery of correspondence between 19th-century pottery workshops had revealed networks of knowledge sharing that crossed family and community boundaries. Technical innovations attributed to male workshop owners were often documented in women's private letters as collaborative developments or individual discoveries that had been appropriated without credit. "This changes everything we thought we knew about craft development in this region," commented Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a professor from Harvard, who specialized in American material culture. "Your documentation of these collaborative networks suggests that artistic innovation was much more democratic and interconnected than previous scholarship indicated." Claire accepted the praise with the confidence that had developed through 2 years of establishing herself as a respected voice in her field. The timid volunteer who had once deferred to others' expertise had evolved into someone whose research was reshaping academic understanding of American craft history. Her authentication skills had opened doors to consulting work with major museums, while her growing reputation as a scholar had led to speaking engagements and publication opportunities that positioned her as an emerging authority in her specialty. The evening's success felt particularly meaningful because it represented the integration of all aspects of her new life. The research had been conducted in collaboration with local artists, who provided contemporary perspectives on historical technique. The exhibition design incorporated pieces from her own pottery work alongside historical artifacts, demonstrating the continuity between past and present creative practice. The reception food featured ingredients from her garden, prepared using recipes adapted from historical sources she had discovered during her research. Marcus approached her near the end of the evening, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose vision had exceeded expectations.
"I have news that might interest you," he said, drawing her aside from the departing guests. "The Smithsonian has been following your work on this exhibition. They're interested in discussing a collaboration on a major show about American craft traditions that would tour nationally." The opportunity represented recognition at the highest level of museum practice, validation that her research was contributing to broader understanding of American cultural history. More personally, it confirmed that her decision to rebuild her career had led to achievements that surpassed anything she might have accomplished within the constraints of her former life. As the last guest departed and the gallery lights dimmed, Claire walked through the exhibition one final time, noting how the pieces seemed to glow in the soft illumination. Each artifact represented hours of research, careful authentication, and thoughtful interpretation. But beyond their academic significance,
They told stories of women who had found ways to express creativity and maintain independence within restrictive social structures. Their resilience resonated with Claire's own journey from constrained wife to autonomous professional. The drive home through Millfield's quiet streets took her past landmarks that had become meaningful during her residence there. The pottery studio where she had developed technical skills that informed her academic work, the harbor where she often walked while processing research ideas, the houses of friends who had become chosen family, supporting her personal growth while engaging seriously with her professional accomplishments. Her own house welcomed her with the particular comfort that came from spaces arranged according to personal preference rather than external expectation. The kitchen, where she had learned to cook for pleasure rather than obligation, still smelled faintly of the herbs she had harvested for the evening's reception. The living room, furnished with pieces she had chosen for comfort and function rather than status display, invited relaxation rather than performance. In her studio, Claire examined the pottery pieces she was developing for her next project, an exploration of glazing techniques that connected historical methods with contemporary environmental concern. The work represented the kind of integration between theory and practice that had become characteristic of her approach to both scholarship and creative work. Her hands, now permanently stained with clay and scarred from kiln work, moved confidently across surfaces she was learning to shape according to her own vision. The phone rang as she was cleaning her tools, and Claire glanced at the caller ID with mild curiosity. David's name appeared on the screen for the first time since their divorce had been finalized 18 months earlier. She considered letting the call go to voicemail but decided that avoiding conversation served no purpose for either of them. "Hello, David," she answered, settling into the chair by her studio window where she often sat to sketch design ideas. "Claire," his voice carried a note of uncertainty she had never heard during their marriage. "I hope I'm not calling too late. I saw the article about your exhibition in the New York Times. Congratulations." The acknowledgement surprised her, not because David was incapable of generosity but because it suggested he had been following her career developments. "Thank you. It's been gratifying to see the research reach a broader audience. The article made it sound like you've become quite successful. Museum exhibitions, consulting work, academic publications. I had no idea you were capable of that level of professional achievement." The comment revealed exactly the limitations in David's understanding that had made their marriage unsustainable. He had supported her volunteer work without recognizing the expertise it developed, had encouraged her interests without perceiving their potential for serious application. His surprise at her success confirmed that he had never seen her as capable of independent accomplishment. "I was always capable," Claire replied gently. "I just needed space to develop abilities that marriage didn't require or encourage." David's silence stretched long enough to suggest he was processing implications he hadn't previously considered. When he spoke again, his voice carried what sounded like genuine regret. "I think I understand now why you left. Not just because of Vanessa, but because I never really saw you as a complete person with your own ambitions and capabilities." The acknowledgement represented more insight than Claire had expected from him, though it came too late to affect her feelings about their relationship. "We both became comfortable with roles that didn't serve either of us well. You needed someone who would manage domestic obligations while you focused on your career. I needed someone who would see me as capable of more than supportive functions. Are you happy?" David asked, the question carrying what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than veiled criticism. Claire considered her response while observing her reflection in the studio window. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the perfectly groomed wife who had maintained David's household while suppressing her own ambition. This version of herself showed the effects of outdoor work, creative experimentation, and emotional authenticity in ways that expensive skincare treatments had never achieved. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy in ways I didn't know were possible when we were married." "I'm glad," David replied, and his sincerity surprised her. "I wanted to call because I realized I never apologized properly for how our marriage ended, not just for the affair, but for not recognizing what you needed to thrive. You deserved better than what I was capable of providing." The apology felt genuine but unnecessary to Claire's emotional well-being. She had moved beyond needing his acknowledgement of fault to feel validated in her choices. "We both deserved better than what we were able to create together. I hope you've found more authentic happiness as well." "I'm working on it," David said with a laugh that sounded more genuine than any she remembered from their marriage. Therapy has been helpful in understanding some patterns I need to change. Vanessa and I didn't work out, but the relationship taught me things about myself that I needed to learn. The conversation concluded with mutual wishes for continued success and happiness, leaving Claire with a sense of completion she hadn't realized she needed. David's recognition of her capabilities and acknowledgement of his limitations provided closure that formal divorce proceedings couldn't achieve. More importantly, his surprise at her accomplishments confirmed how thoroughly she had transformed from the person he had known. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came opportunities that reflected Claire's established reputation in both academic and artistic communities. The Smithsonian collaboration had been formalized, with plans for a major exhibition that would showcase her research alongside contemporary work by artists she had come to know as colleagues and friends. A university press had expressed interest in publishing her research as a book that would make scholarly findings accessible to broader audiences interested in craft history and women's contributions to American material culture. The garden behind her house showed signs of renewed growth as plants that had seemed dormant through winter began producing the fresh greens she would incorporate into spring meals. The raised beds she had expanded and improved during her residency now supported vegetables, herbs, and flowers that reflected both practical needs and aesthetic preferences. Working in the soil with her hands provided meditative balance to the intellectual demands of research and writing. On a particularly warm morning in May, Claire received a phone call that would mark another milestone in her professional development. The caller was Jennifer Martinez, director of a prestigious craft museum in California, with an offer that represented the kind of career opportunity she could never have imagined during her marriage. "We're creating a new position for someone with your unique combination of scholarly expertise and practical craft knowledge," Jennifer explained. The role would involve curating exhibitions, developing educational programs, and leading research initiatives that bridge historical and contemporary craft practice. "Your work on women artisans has impressed our board tremendously." The position would represent a significant advancement in both salary and professional recognition. It would place Claire at the helm of innovative programming at an institution with national influence in craft education and promotion. The opportunity to shape conversations about craft history while supporting contemporary artists appealed to her ambitions for both scholarly impact and community engagement. But as Jennifer outlined the specifics of the offer, Claire found herself considering factors that wouldn't have mattered during her previous life. The California position would require relocating away from the community where she had rebuilt her identity and established meaningful relationships. It would mean leaving the garden she had cultivated, the pottery studio where she was developing personal artistic practice, and the network of friends who had supported her transformation. "The offer is generous," Claire said carefully, "but I'd like time to consider how it fits with other commitments I've developed here." The conversation reminded Claire of how dramatically her decision-making process had changed. During her marriage, career opportunities had been evaluated primarily according to their impact on David's professional needs and their shared social standing. Now she weighed options according to their alignment with her personal values, creative goals, and relationship priority. Over the following week, Claire discussed the California opportunity with friends and colleagues whose opinions she valued. Marcus expressed support for whatever decision would advance her career while acknowledging that losing her would significantly impact the museum's future development. Sarah Chen and other artist friends encouraged her to pursue opportunities that matched her ambitions, while noting that similar work could potentially be developed within their existing community. The most helpful conversation occurred with Helen Carter, whose own career had involved navigating similar choices between advancement and community connection. During dinner at the older woman's home, they explored questions that went beyond immediate professional considerations to address longer-term goals for both career and personal fulfillment. "The most important thing is whether the work allows you to become more of who you are rather than requiring you to adapt to external expectations," Helen said as they sat on her porch overlooking the harbor. "I've seen too many talented people accept positions that looked impressive but ultimately constrained their development because they didn't align with authentic interests and values." By the end of the week, Claire had reached a decision that reflected the confidence and self-knowledge she had developed during her Maine residency. She called Jennifer Martinez to decline the California position while expressing gratitude for the recognition it represented. Instead, She would focus on developing similar programming within her current community, using the Smithsonian collaboration and her growing publication record to establish Millfield as a center for innovative craft research and education. The decision felt right in ways that transcended professional calculation. Claire had discovered that success meant more than advancement through institutional hierarchy. It included the integration of work and life according to personal values, the development of expertise that contributed to meaningful conversations, and the cultivation of relationships that supported both individual growth and community flourish. Summer brought the kind of busy contentment that characterized Claire's new life at its best. Her research for the Smithsonian exhibition involved travel to archives and private collections across New England, documenting artifacts and interviewing contemporary artists whose work reflected historical tradition. The book project progressed steadily, with her publisher expressing enthusiasm for early chapters that combined scholarly rigor with accessible writing about craft development and women's artistic contribution. In her personal life, Claire had begun a relationship with Thomas Reed, a furniture maker whose workshop was located near the harbor. Their connection had developed slowly through shared interests in craft history and compatible approaches to balancing creative work with community engagement. Thomas had been divorced for several years and brought to their relationship the kind of emotional maturity that came from honest self-reflection about past failures. Their partnership felt fundamentally different from Claire's marriage to David. Rather than accommodating conflicting priorities or managing competing demands for attention, they supported each other's individual development while sharing common ground in values and interests. Thomas understood the importance of Claire's research and creative work because he had similar commitments to his own artistic practice. Their conversations engaged seriously with ideas and projects that mattered to both of them. As autumn arrived with its spectacular display of coastal foliage, Claire prepared for the opening of her Smithsonian exhibition in Washington. The preview had generated significant media attention, with advance articles in major publications highlighting her research findings and their implications for understanding American craft history. Museum professionals and scholars were expressing anticipation for work that promised to reshape conventional narratives about artistic development and cultural transmission. The night before her departure for Washington, Claire walked through her house and garden, noting details that had become precious through daily familiarity. The kitchen where she had learned to cook according to her own preference, the studio where she continued developing pottery skills that informed her academic understanding, the garden where vegetables and flowers grew according to her selections and care. Each space reflected choices she had made freely, without accommodation to external expectations or constraints. Standing in her living room, where evening light filtered through windows she had left uncurtained to maximize connection with the landscape outside, Claire reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had discovered her husband's affair 3 years earlier could never have imagined the life she was now living, or the work she was now doing. David's betrayal had forced her to examine assumptions about marriage, success, and personal fulfillment that she might never have questioned otherwise. His affair had inadvertently provided her with the motivation and opportunity to discover capabilities and interests that had been dormant but not destroyed during their marriage. The crisis that had initially seemed devastating had instead cleared space for reconstruction according to her own specifications. The exhibition opening in Washington exceeded all expectations, with attendance that included museum directors, collectors, scholars, and artists from across the country. Claire's research had resonated with audiences who recognized the significance of documenting women's contributions to artistic traditions, while connecting historical practices with contemporary creative work. The conversations that followed her presentation suggested that her findings would influence future scholarship and museum programming in lasting ways. But perhaps more meaningful than professional recognition was the presence of friends from Millfield who had traveled to support her achievement. Marcus, Sarah, Thomas, and several other community members had coordinated their attendance to celebrate work that reflected their shared values about the importance of craft tradition and artistic collaboration. As the evening concluded with plans for future projects and ongoing collaborations, Claire felt the deep satisfaction that came from alignment between personal values and professional accomplishment. She had built a life that reflected her authentic interests and capabilities, surrounded herself with people who supported her growth and engaged seriously with her work, and developed expertise that contributed meaningfully to conversations she cared about. The flight back to Maine took her over landscapes that had become home in ways that transcended simple residence. This was where she belonged, not because circumstances had forced her there but because she had chosen it after careful consideration of alternatives. The community she had joined valued the same things she valued. The work she was doing mattered to people whose opinions she respected. The relationships she had cultivated supported her continued development while providing the emotional connection she had been missing during her marriage. Landing in Portland and driving north along the familiar coastal route, Claire felt the contentment that came from returning to a life she had designed rather than accepted. The house that welcomed her reflected her preferences in furniture, books, and art. The studio where she would return to pottery work the next morning contained projects that expressed her creative vision. The garden that would soon need attention for winter preparation grew plants she had selected and tended according to her own timeline and priority. 3 years earlier, Claire had pretended ignorance while her husband conducted an affair, using that knowledge to plan an escape that seemed impossible to the woman she was then. The transformation from dependent wife to independent professional had required courage she didn't know she possessed, and skills she had forgotten she had developed. But most importantly, it had required the willingness to value her own authenticity more than external expectations or social convention. As she settled into her favorite chair with tea and notes for her next research project, Claire understood that David's affair had been a gift whose value he could never have intended. His betrayal had accidentally freed her to discover who she really was when not constrained by the need to maintain someone else's comfort or support someone else's ambitions. The woman she had become was stronger, more capable, and infinitely happier than the woman she had. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.